And hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Thompson with The Story Behind the Story, a look at books and how they came to be, the effects they had, and the effects that life had on them. It's March 6, 2021, and I'm going to be taking the next 2 weeks to talk about authors who anticipated, in some way, the advent of movies or had their works suffer at the hands of movies. Today, I want to talk about Frank Norris, who was born in 1870, died in 1902. Frank Norris, or Benjamin Franklin Norris Jr., the birth record says, was one of 5 children of a Chicago jeweler and his former actress wife. The jewelry business thrived, and in the 1880s, the Norrises moved to San Francisco, where, like Gertrude Stein's father, Frank's dad did well in real estate. Frank was sent to Paris at 18. He spent 2 years studying painting and reading the works of Émile Zola, whose pioneering work in modern naturalist fiction formed Norris's own later style. Once at home, he studied at the University of California at Berkeley, leaving full of Darwinism and, as Justice Holmes later put it, the social statics of Mr. Herbert Spencer. Norris spent a further year at Harvard, a special student in English Lit, and submitting as a class paper a draft of his 1899 novel, McTeague. He then spent time in New York with the publishers Doubleday and Page, then as a war correspondent in South Africa, a newspaper sub-editor, and a burgeoning writer. His time covering the Spanish-American War marked the end of his youthful wanderings. After marrying in 1900, he had a child in 1901. The family returned to San Francisco, and he died there of peritonitis in 1902. As has often been told, Norris came to work one morning to his publisher's office, pale and trembling all over with excitement, and gasping out almost inarticulately, "I've got a big idea, a great big idea, the biggest idea ever." It was the outlined scheme for his trilogy of the Epic of the Wheat, the trilogy which began with 1901's The Octopus and 1903's The Pit, and which Norris did not live to round out with The Wolf. Norris's writing, which began in journalism and moved quickly into short stories and novels, was emblematic of the rapid changes in America at the zenith of the Gilded Age. His early work, though fairly conventional in style, nevertheless showed his interest in social and political issues. Industrialization was transforming the country. The reaction came in the founding of the Populist Party, the debates over bimetallism, and the nomination of William Jennings Bryan, barely old enough to hold the office, for president in 1896. But Norris's work matured fast, and he was soon denounced by critics for his appalling Zola-esque frankness. As one reviewer of a Norris biography noted in the 1930s, in the fiction of Norris's day, men and women never had sex, and they never vomited or urinated. Norris's McTeague covered all of that and much more. The tale of a San Francisco dentist whose career implodes. It chronicles McTeague's and his wife's descent into poverty, avarice, and murder. Having grown up in the goldfields, McTeague reverts to the brutality with which he was raised when he returns to them in hope of a quick financial score. He ends up in the middle of Death Valley, out of water, and handcuffed to a man he has just killed. The Octopus from 1901 is another tale of how thin the veneer of civilization is in most people. It uses a railroad baron's empire, building as the story's scaffolding. By then, Norris had developed a telegraphic style, jumping from thought to unrelated thought, yet making one follow the other as logically as day and night. It was an idea Henry Jardina wrote in the Open Source Review that Norris got from the new medium of motion pictures. He wrote, in his 1899 novel McTeague, a group of characters go to the theater and are treated to a short film as part of the program. Their responses vary from wonder to distrust as they are faced with the sheer impossibility of what appears before them. McTeague himself is, quote, awestruck. Look at that horse move his head, he cried excitedly, quite carried away. Look at that cable car coming, and the man going across the street. See, here comes a truck. Well, I never in all my life. McTeague's description of an early commercial film audience is a scene that fits queerly into the rest of the story as a strange foreboding of things to come. In McTeague's incredulity, his mother-in-law's distrust of the film apparatus as a kind of trick, and his wife Trina's enchantment at the device, the reader gets an encapsulated view of the different responses to one of the most violently modern events of the time, a trip to the movies to see a past reality unfold as if in real time before people who were slightly unable to believe in this reality. This is part of Norris's grand project. Throughout the small but thematically consistent body of work he produced from the age of 29 to his death 3 years later at 32. A depiction of the everyday shock of new media and industrialization, the concept of capturing time and presenting its fictional form as the truth through the film apparatus. Even if the story of audience members fainting at the arrival of a train on screen is, as many suspect, a fiction, the reason for its existence as lore stems from a very real disjuncture, part of the premise of the industrial age. How can the present reality hold a living document of the past? How can a unit of time lost make such a realistic appearance in the present? By the turn of the century, the complex relationship between the way life was being represented and the way representation was changing the structure of real lived life was becoming a study in itself. Henri Bergson, lecturing in Paris in 1902, compared the mechanism of thought and the mechanism of the camera. In everyday life, he said, we can hardly do anything else than set going a kind of cinematograph inside us. Norris's book, The Octopus, came out in 1901, a year before Bergson's lecture. In it, one of the main characters has a filmic vision before falling asleep, described as by one critic as his mind relaxed in that strange hypnotic condition that comes just before sleep. A series of pictures of the day's doings passed before his imagination like the roll of a kinetoscope. And here will pop up an image from that story, The Californians, which gives you an idea of that style. As Giardino rightly argues, Norris was inventing the jump cut style of filmmaking only on paper. Little wonder that his novels were seized upon by the silent film industry. Sweeping morality tales that ended not with Miss Prism's smug assurance that, quote, the good ended badly and the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means, Cecily. But rather with general disaster, were felt to be the kind of splashy stories movie makers adored. In Norris's world, the good could end badly just as easily as the bad, and the bad could escape all sanction to become rich and powerful. 1903's The Pit, part of a planned trilogy on the American industrial commercial system based on the journey of wheat from field to table, focused on the commodities traders of Chicago. It went to Broadway in 1904 and film in 1917. D.W. Griffith filmed a Norris story about a corner on the wheat market in 1909. Still another Norris story was a Rudolph Valentino vehicle in 1922. McTeague, however, was and remains Norris's monument. Filmed only once in 1915, it was the obsession of the German-American director Erich von Stroheim, who filmed it in 1923. He saw the story as a modern Greek tragedy in which environment and human willfulness trapped the characters in a foreordained, slow-motion doom. Stroheim produced a 300-page shooting script and shot the entire film on location around San Francisco. He built no sets, using only period locations to replace buildings lost in the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. He spent 2 months in Death Valley, filming the novel's climactic scenes, and ended up with 85 hours of film that took nearly a year to edit into a finished product of unheard of length. Greed was shown only once in its entirety at a studio screening in 1924. All present agreed it was the best film they'd ever seen, perhaps the best film ever made. But Stroheim's studio was completing a merger into what became Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and he found himself once again under the direction of production chief Irving Thalberg, who'd fired Stroheim at Universal Pictures in 1922 for cost overruns and being a general pain in the neck. Thalberg demanded cuts, and lots of them. Stroheim's version, which featured gold tint applied frame by frame, was reduced from 10 hours to 8 to 6 to 4 hours, and finally to 2.5 in an edit by MGM's head scriptwriter, who got the writing credit for the script as well. Narrative cards were used to fill in the gaps the cuts left, and the result was a huge flop that lost a ton of money and severely wounded Stroheim's reputation. For its part, MGM determined to drive a nail into Stroheim's professional coffin by devoting little promotional effort to the movie, and its claims of huge losses were widely believed to have been generated by combining the ledgers of another highly profitable Stroheim film, The Merry Widow, with Greed's in order to reduce Stroheim's royalty payment. After being fired in 1929 by Joseph P. Kennedy over the making of Queen Kelly, a Gloria Swanson vehicle, Stroheim returned to acting but lived to have the last laugh. His career and Swanson's was revived by Billy Wilder's 1950 roman à clef, Sunset Boulevard, and critical acclaim for Greed swelled in its trail through the 1950s. Publication of Stroheim's script after his death in 1957 made it possible to reconstruct the cuts and launched a decades-long search for a complete version. The closest realization of the work has been Turner Classic Movies' 1999 restoration, which used recovered bits and studio still photos to create a 4-hour version that makes evident what a dazzling thing the original must have been. Frank Norris, who died at the age of 32, was buried in Oakland, California, beneath an 8-foot pedimented stone erected by his Berkeley fraternity brothers. His literary heirs have included Theodore Dreiser, Upton Sinclair, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and John Updike, though over the last century his anti-Semitism, fondness for eugenics, and belief in women's biological inferiority, not to mention his tendency to overwrite. One critic compared Norris's style to, quote, a wet dog, both common in his day, had dented his reputation, though his novels remain in print to this day, a staple of college English lit reading lists. Doubleday, his one-time employer, published his collected works in 10 volumes in 1928. The limited 245-set Argonaut edition is in full gray-brown Levant Morocco, tooled and gilt on the covers and spines with raised bands, red Levant Morocco doublures tooled and gilt, moire silk-free end leaves on Morocco hinges, and top edges with gilt, an exceptionally well-bound set, which turns up occasionally still in beautiful condition, with an original sheet of ink manuscript by Frank Norris from Meteague and inserted in the front of volume 1. It is a 16 by 10 inch sheet of paper that folds and has the original ink smears and fingerprints of the author. The set consists of the author's complete works, including The Octopus, The Pit, McTeague, and others, with introductions by H.L. Mencken, Theodore Dreiser, Christopher Morley, and others. Volume 10 represents the first edition of the previously uncollected articles and stories, and the last set I saw was on sale for $3,500. So that's the story behind the works of Frank Norris, who saw books as movies and whose books were, in turn, done in by a movie. Next week, I'll take a look at another author whose work didn't wear well, but remains in literary purgatory, Hugh Lofting, the creator of Dr. Dolittle.